Welcome to Mission 150, the podcast that tells stories from 150 years of Seventh-day Adventist mission to the world. To find out more about the mission of the Adventist Church today, go to adventistmission.org. That's adventistmission.org. I'm Sam Nevis.
And I'm David Trim.
David, today we are going to India.
Yes.
Last episode we went to China and we talked about many people that sacrificed sometimes their lives to the mission in China. And now we go to the other giant of population, India.
Yes, and we're going to talk about some of the first two generations of missionaries to India, which today constitutes the Seventh-day Adventist Church's Southern Asia Division. And again, we will see that the church was built up by sacrifice. So let's start in 1895, when a party of American missionaries arrived in Kolkata. They were led by Doris and Edna Robinson. Doris had previously been leader of the church's British mission, and he'd also previously worked in South Africa. He now became the first superintendent of the India mission. Frederick W. Brown, a nurse, and his wife Catherine, a teacher, sailed for India on December 14, 1898, and arrived at Calcutta on February 9, 1899. So it took them about 7 weeks to get there.
Where are they from?
They're from America.
Okay.
Fred is a recent graduate of Battle Creek Sanitarium.
Okay.
And so they arrive in Calcutta in February 1899, where they joined the staff of the mission located at Beau Bazaar Street. And in our video version, we'll share a photograph of a group photo of the staff of the mission and some of the people they were working for. In the summer of 1899, Fred and Katie were sent northwest to Ranchi, the capital of Bihar. In the autumn, a smallpox epidemic broke out in Bihar. But the Brown family, along with Doris Robinson and his wife Edna, refused to leave the region, which many Europeans did leave the region. Instead, the Robinsons and the Browns moved to Kalmata, where there was a small Adventist school and orphanage, and where the epidemic was raging with particular intensity, but with almost no medical care from Europeans who had vacated it in order to save their own lives.
So they went into the epicenter of the epidemic because
they wanted to help.
They wanted to help.
Yeah. All four missionaries worked closely with smallpox victims, and all four contracted the disease. Edna and Katie both survived. They suffered, but they survived. Their husbands were not so fortunate. On December 21, 1899, Fred Brown passed away. He had been serving as a missionary in India for a little more than 10 months. The next month, when word reached them, his former classmates at Battle Creek voted a resolution. His life and death shall be to us an inspiration to continue steadfast in the work in which he has fallen, to bear the good tidings of salvation from sin and suffering to earth's needy ones.
Wow.
Meanwhile, on December 29, so 8 days after Fred, Doris Robinson passed away too, having served in India for almost 5 years. The church leader W.C. White wrote, "Overwork had unfitted him to battle with so dread a disease." Robinson's deputy was William Spicer, and he traveled up from Kolkata to Kalmata, and as he later wrote, "I was with Robinson in his last conscious hours. I told him that if he must lay down his work, perhaps God would use that to draw attention to India's needs. He replied with his swollen lips, 'Perhaps, I hope.'" Those were Robinson's last words, and expressed his hope, a blessed hope, that the third angel's message would suffuse India and would be aided by other missionaries coming to help do it. Brown and Robinson are buried in Kalmata, their graves side by side along with that of a little orphan boy, one of those for whom they willingly gave their lives. And we have photos of their grave sites, and on the video version we'll share those. 21 years later, a woman called Eva Clements died in Rangoon, which was, as it was then called, today it's the city of Yangon and the capital city of the country of Myanmar, which used to be known as Burma. Her death in November 1920 a very young age, and after only 7 months in the mission field, ended, or rather was in the middle of, a bad spell for the Southern Asia Division during which 7 church workers died.
Wow.
Charles F. Lowry, like Eva Clements, died in Yangon, but 20 months before her on February 14, 1919. Charles and his wife Eva had arrived in Burma on September 18, 1916. Charles had recently turned 30 and he had been called to be superintendent of the Burma mission. Church leaders in India soon recognized, in the words of W. W. Fletcher, the division assistant secretary, quote, "In Brother Lowry we had a man of most devoted spirit and excellent judgment to lead out in the work." His colleague in Burma, G. F. Hamilton, subsequently wrote, "His whole heart was in Burma. The people in their great need appealed to him very strongly. He willingly took the risks incidental to mission labor in the tropics and paid the full price." So Charles Lowry died on February 14, 1919 of smallpox. He'd served as a missionary for not quite 2.5 years.
There is a school with that name in
Yes.
India. Lowry.
That's in India. That's named after his brother, who we'll talk about later in the episode.
Okay.
Yeah, G.G. Lowry,
And we talked about Spicer.
who also has a university named
That's
after
right.
him. That's right. 6 missionaries died in India in 1919 and 1920. They included Edith Bruce, a missionary nurse from America, and she was a veteran missionary to India. She'd served there since 1908. So that's, almost 12 years. She died on October 12, 1920 at the age of 53. Her obituary pays a moving tribute, but one that's typical in terms of how missionary deaths were regarded by their colleagues. This is what a colleague wrote: "We laid her to rest on the quiet slope of the lower ranges of the mighty Himalayas, until those ancient mountains shall catch the gleam of the bright morning, when Jesus shall come to redeem from the grave the saints whose death is so precious in his sight, and whose last resting place he marks so tenderly."
That's so beautiful.
It is, isn't it? It really is. On top of these losses came the passing of Ernest Chapman in January 1922 in his homeland of Australia, but after becoming fatally ill in India. Ernie Chapman and his wife Elsie, both graduates of Australasian Missionary College, had only landed in India on November 9, 1920. Ernie had been called to work in publishing, so that's coordinating the translation and publication of Adventist literature into Indian languages, and then coordinating their sale by teams of indigenous colporteurs. Elsie served as a Bible worker, but Ernie's assignment necessarily entailed immense effort, including outside the relative comfort of mission compounds. He threw himself wholeheartedly into the work, but that entailed certain risks. And while he seems to have had an immediate impact, there were personal health consequences. By July 1921, so 8 months after he's arrived, it's clear that he had contracted a serious case of tuberculosis complicated by tropical fevers. We don't know which ones. We've talked about this before. Westerners still hadn't worked out all the diseases that existed in the tropics. So he has tuberculosis plus some kind of fever. So the Chapmans were reassigned from Calicut in southwest India to Bangalore, which at an altitude of 3,000 feet was cooler and was thought to have a better climate. So the hope is that he'll recover.
That's in the south.
That's in the south, yeah. But by the end of October 1921, Ernie was so ill that Elsie had to write his letters home for him. So church leaders decided to send the Chapmans back to Australia in the hope that he would recover.
But he doesn't.
No, they travelled from Bangalore to Ceylon, where they took ship from Australia, and that went fine. They sailed from Colombo to Australia on December 15, 1921, not quite 13 months after they arrived in India. But by the time they got to Perth in Western Australia, his condition had declined. And so rather than continuing on the ship to their home city of Melbourne, once they made landfall at Perth on December 16, he was immediately taken to the Wooroloo Sanitarium, an Adventist sanitarium in Perth. Ernie expressed the hope that he would be able to return to India. But it was already too late. He had several hemorrhages of the lungs. His last words were, "I just want a long sleep. I am very tired." And he's in his long sleep even now.
Waiting for Jesus to return.
He was just 26 years old.
As you're describing this, David, it occurred to me the need for the mission compound.
Right.
Sometimes I travel to various places, and there is such a marked difference between outside of the compound and inside of the compound. Sometimes you drive from the airport and you go through very precarious housing and open sewage and all sorts of issues, and then suddenly you get to a compound. The doors open and you're back in Eden. It's beautiful. There are animals roaming, and it's a beautiful compound where the mission is.
Yep. Or in some cases, even it's bigger than a compound. It's a large campus.
Right. And I've often looked at it and thought, oh my goodness, it's too much of a contrast. And why do we have these,
right?
Resort-like, minus the swimming pools, but this resort-like, environment. But when I look at this and I see the number of missionaries that die because of the conditions and the disease and so on, it makes perfect sense that you would have a base where they would be safer and more hygienic environment, and that's a matter of life and death.
And the hygiene's an important part of it.
Sure.
If you can control the hygiene, even today, you, like me and probably some others, have experienced traveling in parts of the world where the water isn't safe, and we inadvertently take on some local water and we get a bad case of stomach upset.
Even when the lettuce is washed with regular water, you have problems.
Right, that can happen.
And not to mention the open sewage and all the rest of the issues. And because it's a matter of life and death, at least a mission compound needs to be somewhere that they can
control the environment.
Because you read that Chapman worked outside of mission compounds in many different situations.
And that's something. And that's something I want to come back to. But the good thing is to say those years, 1919 to 1922, those were not typical years.
We lost 6. You said
7.
Those
had been especially bad. And actually, as medicine and public hygiene improved in the British colony of India, Adventist missionaries' life expectancy increased. But the nations that are today Burma, India, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka remain places where there was a much greater risk of serious illness, even than other mission fields. And I want to tell 2 stories that illustrate this. In 1909, a young graduate of the Southern Training School, now Southern Adventist University, and his wife accepted a call to serve as missionaries in India. Their names were Gentry G. Lowry, he was 25, and Bertha, his wife, who was 23. And in the General Conference archives, we have a photograph of them at a camp meeting in Tennessee early in 1909, which we'll share in the video version. And so that actually shows them as they were when they went to India the same year.
Wow.
For people who are listening to the audio version, by the way, all the photographs that we're sharing are in my book, A Living Sacrifice, which is where these stories are taken from. And you can imagine, here's a young couple from the hill country of Tennessee, 25 and 23. How alien must have India seemed to them. And yet they loved India. They fell in love with India. They gave their lives to India. In 1915, Lowry established the South India Training School, the ancestor of today's Spicer Adventist University, which we talked about a moment ago.
Right.
From 1920 to 36, Lowry worked across the Southern Asia Division, serving sequentially as superintendent of several unions, including Burma, where his brother Charles had died in 1919. We touched on that.
Charles Lowry.
Charles Lowry, yeah. Gentry Lowry developed a reputation as a skillful and capable Christian leader. Furthermore, he was known for what a colleague humorously called the gift of tongues, because over the years he became proficient in Tamil, Malayalam, Telugu, Kannarese, and Urdu.
That is amazing.
And he could also converse and preach in Hindi and Bengali.
These are not easy languages.
These are not easy languages, absolutely not. They're very different to English.
Certainly from the south of the United States to all those languages, that's a jump.
No, that's remarkable. While superintendent of the Northeast India Union Mission, however, Gentry started to have health problems that became increasingly severe. They actually started in 1933 when he had needed surgery for appendicitis. But complications followed, and he suffered from chronic acute abdominal pain. Another surgery took place in 1935, but the pain continued, and doctors warned that he needed treatment in a hospital in Britain or the United States.
Because surgeries back then were not the same as surgeries today. So
No, I mean, it would have been done in a very modern hospital because there were modern hospitals in India by then. But yeah, surgery is not as straightforward then as it is today, especially if, today appendicitis would be a relatively minor operation or should be. But the doctors also warned him that India's climate was bad for his health, and so he should go home for the surgery and not return.
mm,
On March 22, 1936, the Southern Asia Division Committee voted to send Lowry home for surgery with the expectation that he wouldn't come back. A few days later, he, Bertha his wife, and their younger son Roscoe were at the train station in Ranchi. An Indian pastor, Jonas Singh, was one of many who came to see him off. And Pastor Singh later remembered that he fought back tears as he said goodbye to Gentry, Bertha, and Roscoe. His memory was that he said, "I will see you in heaven, Lowry Saab." Saab being a local term that indicates respect.
mm.
So, "I will see you in heaven, Lowry Saab." But Pastor Singh never forgot his astonishment when Lowry replied, "No, Brother Jonas, I will see you next year. God has his plans for this church in India. I believe I am part of them, and if I'm right, he will spare my life long enough to do what I need to do."
So he was disagreeable with the action taken by the board, essentially.
That's right. Don't try to save my life. I've got a higher purpose. So he went home, he had the surgery, but sure enough, he returned to India in 1937.
Just like he said he would.
Just like he said he would. In 1941, he was elected as president of the South Asia Division, the Southern Asia Division. Well, that's a bad time to be elected president, because he soon faced immense challenges, for Japanese armies overran Burma early in 1942, while the Japanese Navy attacked ports in modern Sri Lanka, what was then called Ceylon, and in India. Adventist missionaries had to be evacuated under difficult conditions from Burma, and he now had to lead a church that has the challenges of operating in a war zone.
Wow.
A colleague wrote after his death, "The wartime dangers that threatened and seemed to be scattering the lifetime work of our brother were a great burden on his heart and mind. The results of nearly 50 years of labor and giving and the lives of many workers were in jeopardy. Momentous decisions had to be made. Uncertainty and anxiety were in the air, and it was in the midst of the hottest season experienced for 50 years. And after his years of service, Lowry's health was not robust. The impact of immense stress on a weakened constitution was fatal. And on May 4, 1942, Gentry Lowry suffered a stroke and died. But he at least had worked there, in comparison to some that we've talked about, Sam. He'd worked there for 33 years.
Very long life.
Yeah, 33 years. So he gives his life both for India and to India. He and Bertha give their lives to India because they stay there. And Bertha stays on. Bertha does not go home for, I think, another decade. Bertha stays on because she loves India, just as he did. And remember, in the belief that Indian conditions were affecting his health, which they probably were, church leaders had offered him the chance. They'd even encouraged him to return permanently to his homeland, the United States. This gave him the prospect of preserving his life. Instead, in the words of Isaiah, he offered up his soul unto death, because actually, India had become his real homeland. Sharing the good news in Southern Asia was his passion. But when he passed away, he was not yet 58 years old. So even after the improvements in medicine and hygiene, Southern Asia still takes a toll on people. And here's the other story I said I'd tell too. Robert A. Beckner left America in 1908, aged just 22, and went as a missionary to Burma. Again, today it's known as Myanmar.
Is that where the division headquarters were?
No, the division headquarters were in Lahore. actually in what today is Pakistan, but
Oh, I
was
see.
then part of British India. But
Okay.
Burma was part of the British Indian Empire.
Okay.
Yeah. 2 years later, Robert married an American expatriate, Mabel McMoran, and the two served in Burma until 1923. So that's what, 15 years. When Mabel's serious illness forced them to take permanent return to the homeland. Sadly, Mabel died in Melrose Sanitarium near Boston not long after reaching the United States. So what do you think Robert does? A year later, he married again to Ethel May, and she went with him when he returned to Burma. He goes back there to the country that had fatally weakened his first wife.
Yeah, and the second wife
Is willing
goes
to go
with
with him. Yes,
That's the part that's pretty crazy.
yeah, it's that same level of commitment that we've seen before. The same level that says there's a work to be done sharing Jesus, and I'm willing to do it, even though it means risking my life.
Sometimes I get the sense that it is better to have a shorter life that is dripping with purpose than a long one that is meaningless. And that's what young people still today are trying to run away from. We all desperate for meaning,
Mm,
and the meaninglessness of what our general culture presents
yeah,
means that we should be seen, and indeed we are, and I think it will only increase, a resurgent of mission drive, because it is better to sacrifice and have that purpose and meaning that your life has counted for something that is so profound than just to have a long life where you go to work, come back home without any particular purpose in it.
yeah. No, that may well be true. But in this case, Blackner actually stays in southern Asia for another 17 years. He and Ethel have 2 sons and 3 daughters, all of them born in the mission field. Apart from a brief stint at the Oriental Watchman publishing house in Pune in India, Robert and Ethel and their children mostly engaged in frontline mission work in areas that were rugged and disease-ridden. A colleague later wrote, without any of the conveniences of modern life, they labored uncomplainingly and happily for the Burmese and the Karens, who are an ethnic people of Myanmar. This labor took a toll in the form of ill-defined fevers, amoebic dysentery, and other ailments. Now, even just saying amoebic dysentery doesn't sound good.
Nope, whatever it is. No.
When the family took a furlough in 1933-34, for instance, they were all found to have amoeba parasites. The oldest son had worms, and Ethel was anemic.
Wow.
So there's a toll for everybody.
And again, that must have had something to do with the open sewage that is still
Yeah,
today.
of course. Exactly. The poor hygiene, the water that is full of bacteria and parasites, absolutely. Towards the end of the 1930s, Robert, according to what a colleague wrote later, realized that his physical powers were weakening. Yet he labored faithfully on, taking long, perilous jungle trips when the strain must have told heavily on his already failing vitality. Robert himself wrote in November 1940, "This past year I have found myself without much endurance and easily subject to fever. The doctors feared I would not pull through." In a letter to his family back in America that we have in the General Conference archives, he describes in gruesome detail how over several months sores, which are a regular hazard in the jungle, stopped healing. So he has these open sores on his body and they stop healing because he's not in a good state of general health. He wrote to his family that the sores might leak a great deal of bad blood with a good deal of pus discharged. He wrote, doctors drained a lot of pussy blood, but still infection proceeded. I don't even like to think about it. I'm reading it out, but I don't like to think about it.
But he doesn't stop.
He does not stop. A colleague described how the many prayers of the native believers who loved him so well ascended to God and his life was spared, but only for the moment. The Beckners finally returned to the United States after Robert had spent 32 years in southern Asia, and he returned with chronic appendicitis, chronic enteritis, and septicemia. He was admitted to Glendale Sanitarium.
He could have died from any of those
He could
two
have died
last
from
things
any,
you just said.
absolutely, any of those things could have killed you. He had them all, and he was admitted to Glendale Sanitarium, but he was too weak, and he died there in April 1941, a month after arriving home in the States. But nevertheless, he had had the 32 years there. So he's somebody who both gives his life for Southern Asia and gives his life to Southern Asia, because he spends his whole adult life there from the time he's 22. He was aged only 55, yet he was worn out by arduous service. And I think this is an important point, Sam. Like Doris Robinson and Gentry Lowry, he was worn out by overwork.
I'm trying to get into his psyche at this point, because you've got sores around your body. Doctors are pulling pus out.
Yeah,
And if that doesn't tell you, hey, take a break.
yeah. This is it. At times, probably even though Lowry disregarded the church administrators, and if we think back to the episode with William Baxter, where the Inter-American Division tried to save his life by saying, put him, he's too sick, put him on a pension. And he said, no. And he appeals the decision, I'm better now, send me back. And he did, and spent several more years there. But maybe at times we do need our administrators to say, you know what, you need to take a break. Because I think you're right, a meaningful life, a life full of purpose is a blessing. But you don't want to unnecessarily give up your life either. But it's the commitment, Sam, the commitment to sharing Jesus, which is so full-throated, so wholehearted, that you're willing to make any sacrifice.
I think it takes a level of maturity too, which some of them never got to have, which is to throw yourself, you throw yourself into the mission, but you need to throw yourself into your family too.
Yes. Yeah.
And your own health. So I think to some degree, it's a lack of priority. I remember once when I received a call to go to another part of the world. I was working in Britain at the time, and Amy, my wife, said, nope, I'm not going. And I'm like, what am I going to do? Because I really wanted to go, and she said, no, I'm not going. And at some point, she looked and said, you can go if you like by yourself, but I'm not going. And I don't know exactly what she meant by that, but I thought immediately, it hit me. I said, hold on a minute. If I don't have a family, I don't have ministry. So if I don't invest, because I'm prone to overwork as much as anyone, really.
Yeah.
If I don't invest the same level of commitment to my family and to my health, I'm going to have less ministry as a consequence of that process.
Yes.
And therefore, I'm going to sabotage the very thing that I would give my life for.
Right.
And I think but I'm the product of listening to people tell me that throughout my training, my bachelor's, my master's, all of my work. And I think to some degree, the church has come to I would like to believe we've come to a more mature understanding of this, that we need to make sure that our ministers understand that giving it all means that in the medium to long term, your impact may be diminished because you did not take care of yourself, because you did not pause.
Right. And, he loves the people love him. Wouldn't it have been great if he'd taken a little better care of himself and been able to work there another 5 years?
Yeah, that's sobering.
So I don't necessarily mean that we should, the stories we're telling, I don't necessarily mean we should emulate them in every respect.
Sure.
Because I think there are times when we can look back with hindsight and say, was this the wisest thing? Was this the best thing even for the mission? But what we can emulate is the commitment that says, this is so, so, so important to share Jesus, to save souls, to make people's lives better now and give them the chance of being in heaven in the future.
Indeed.
The commitment is extraordinary. And actually, I think some of our listeners might say, why was the death toll so high amongst Adventist missionaries? Were they doing something wrong?
How is that comparing to other missionaries or do we know, or pretty much the same?
In the late 19th century, we know the death toll amongst missionaries in general is pretty horrific. And in Africa, an average of 2 years service is it. But as time goes on into the 20th century, I think Adventists suffer particularly. So I think the Adventist death toll at times is bad. And I don't think it was because they were doing something wrong. In a sense, it was because they were doing something right. Because the chief reason, I think, for the high death toll amongst Adventist missionaries in the late 19th and early 20th centuries is that they didn't remain on mission compounds. They didn't remain in enclaves or institutions. Instead, they worked for the local people and among those people. Whereas many Westerners, even missionaries, were influenced by racism. And they tried to seclude themselves as much as possible from the indigenous population.
In Adventists, no. We jump in.
Adventists jump in. Adventists wanted to be among the people as much as possible so that they could emulate the healing and teaching ministry of Jesus.
Ellen White wrote the book Ministry of Healing, where she drives this point constantly throughout the entire book. And it just occurred to me that there is a mirroring of this effect in Christianity in general, where you have, in Carthage, for example, Christians going to the sick instead of running away from them.
Plague-ridden, yes, absolutely.
Exactly. So that's some would say that's the birth or the start of healthcare, because you have a concerted effort,
yes,
that are going to help the sick, and later that develops into better forms of healthcare in that sense. Instead of just one doctor to others, there is a system that helps.
And so we know absolutely from the earliest times, from the early church, as you say, Christians were concerned about caring for people.
And the work in India has even today, there are multiple hospitals across the country and multiple academic institutions.
Adventist ones.
Adventist ones, dozens, if not hundreds of schools and elementary.
Several universities.
Universities. So their work has...
Including one named after G.G. Lowry.
Yeah, which is in the South, if I'm not mistaken.
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah, many Westerners are influenced by racism. They want to keep themselves away from indigenous populations. Adventists want to be among the people. That was the case with the Robinsons and the Browns, not fleeing the smallpox epidemic in Kamata, but staying there and working for the victims. In consequence of this mindset, Adventist missionaries were exposed to disease and to dangerous situations, and so they died. They died, though, because they wanted to tell people of their Savior. To quote the Apostle Paul, they offered themselves up as living sacrifices. Well, that brings us to an end of this episode. Thanks so much again for joining us in this episode. Please keep watching on AdventistReview.tv, on the Seventh-day Adventist Church's YouTube channel, or listening on your favorite podcast platform. If you've enjoyed this episode, please share it with your friends. And if you want to know more about Adventist mission work and missionaries today, go to adventistmission.org. If you want to find mission opportunities today, go to vividfaith.com. We'll be back soon with more on the inspiring history of Adventist mission around the world.